So we had a little bit of a break, but we are not only today, but then we're going to meet again next week, and then a while. So my thought for today was I want to talk about, as I had said last time, I want to talk about Hannah Arendt and her writings on Zionism, and her take on Zionism, her critique of Zionism, and then starting next week, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of what her ideas are in Origins of Totalitarianism. So I want to I'll map it out depending on the amount of sessions we have left. I wanted to make sure we had time to go through that, and then also talk through the whole issue and her ideas and the controversy over Eichmann in Jerusalem. And then whatever we have time in the middle, we can squeeze in some of her other stuff after we get through the Origins of Totalitarianism stuff. And there's excerpts of that all in this book. So I know a number of you got the portable Hannah Arendt. So if you have that, then starting for next week, we could look in the section on section 3, which is totalitarianism. There are 3 of those 5 selections are from Origins of Totalitarianism, namely the first 3. So you can read through those, the Jews in society, expansion, and total domination, and I'll kind of go through those. And then the next, those are the excerpts there from, and actually, not only that, but in Section 2, Stateless Persons, the section called The Perplexities of the Rights of Man, which is page 31, is also from Origins of Totalitarianism. So what I figured I'd do, since a lot of you bought this book, that I'll go through those sections starting next week. So we'll start with The Perplexities of the Rights of Man, which is on page 31 of the portable Hannah Arendt. And then the selections in part 3, the first 3, are on totalitarianism there. So those are the selections that was selected in this volume. From Origins of Totalitarianism is like about 600 pages, so we're not gonna, subject you to all of that. Okay, so this is what I wanted to do for today. There was one section here that related her writings on Zionism, which I said you could take a look at, which is the short essay called "The Jewish Army: The Beginning of a Jewish Politics." And after that, I want to bring you through other passages that are in the other readings that wasn't in this book, but some of the writings that she did on Zionism, and share some of her views there. So this section, which is the Jewish Army, it was on page 46 of the portable Hannah Arendt. I'm just flipping to it. This was a piece that she published in 1941. So this is right at the World War II is happening, and she's, just on the occasion of the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, American Zionist organizations have publicly called for a Jewish army for the defense of Palestine. So there was a real concern that the Yeshuv, which was the Jewish establishment in the land of Israel, was in danger as Rommel, right, who was the commander of the German armies in Africa, was moving towards Egypt and Arnott's way, and then the concern was that once the Nazis got to Palestine, then the Yeshuv, the Jews who lived there, would be subject to the same fate as the Jews in Europe were subject to. And in 1941, not everyone knew what was happening, but they knew enough that it would be catastrophic for the Jews, whoever fell under Nazi control. Something that Hannah Arendt herself knew, right? Because remember, she escaped Germany about a year after the Nazis came to power, emigrated to France, and then got out of France, right, with the help of Arian Fry, we talked about, and managed to get very lucky in being able to escape from France after we talked about her story. She was arrested by the Gestapo, spent a couple of weeks in Germany, in Berlin jail, then in France, spent some time in an internment camp in France before she was then out of that, and then was able to get to the United States. So she's writing this article in 1941 that's only been in the U.S. barely a year. And there's the sense that there is a mortal danger, and that the Jews in the land of Israel are in mortal danger, as the Jews in Europe are in mortal danger. So she's supporting she's writing basically in support here of the Zionist organization's call for a Jewish army to defend the Jews in Palestine. And she says, rather than just fight with the British, it should be under a Jewish flag and a Jewish army. And this was what became the Jewish Legion which was a unit in the British Armed Forces of Jewish volunteers who fought as a part of along with the British against the Germans in the First World War. And it was somewhat controversial, right? How do you work with the British? Because the British were not the greatest towards, they had the white paper in the 30s in limiting Jewish immigration to Palestine, trying to escape from persecution in Nazi Germany. Yet, nevertheless, the position of the Jewish establishment in Israel was to work with British, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, in a sense, and that the greatest enemy was the Germans, and they had to join forces there and do everything that they could. And she is supportive of that. And remember, Hannah Arendt worked for the World Zionist Organization when she was a Jewish emigre in France, right, where she helped organize young Jews and get them to go to Israel, to train them in agricultural training, and then get them to Palestine, working around the British strictures on immigration. So she was very involved, hands on the ground in those efforts when she was in France. And now she's here supportive of actually forming a Jewish military unit. Her view changes in a few years, which we'll get to. So this is probably one of the most pro-Zionist of her writings. Demands and resolutions by a political avant-garde which does not directly express the will of the community can only become creative policy if they succeed in mobilizing wide sections of the nations. That means you can say anything you want, but it doesn't account for anything in real political change unless you have boots on the ground, in a sense, unless you're carrying your ideas through with actions. If they do not succeed in this, then the finest programs and the most correct resolutions will simply go down in history as lost opportunities. What is today still the isolated demand of Palestinian Jewry and of its representatives abroad must tomorrow become the living will of large sections of the nations to take up the struggle against Hitler as Jews in Jewish units under the Jewish flag. And then she says the defense of Palestine is a part of the struggle for the freedom of the Jewish people. Only when the Jewish people is ready to commit itself fully to this struggle will it be able to defend Palestine. So that's the beginning, right? So the idea is that we need to stand up, and Jews need to enlist now and fight. And it's, there's a call to action there, that there is a mortal danger to the establishment, and you can't depend on others and can't hope for miracles. When we're literally under attack, then you have to raise up arms and defend your home. The Jewish will to live is both famous and notorious. Famous because it occupies a relatively long period of time in the history of European peoples, right? Jewish people have been around for a long time. Notorious because in the last 200 years it has threatened to degenerate into something quite negative, the will to survive at all costs. Our national decline began with the collapse of the Shabtai Tzvi movement. So let me say a little word about that. So what do you know about Shabtai Tzvi? Shabtai Tzvi is the false Jewish Messiah, right, in the mid-17th century, who was declared to be the Messiah, and there was a broad movement across Europe, Sephardim, Ashkenazim, who all believed that he was the Messiah. People were selling their homes, their possessions, ready to go to the land of Israel, and then eventually the Ottoman authorities saw that this was concerning because Palestine was a part of the Ottoman Empire. So Shabtai Tzvi is arrested in Constantinople and is given a choice to convert to Islam or die. He converts. He is given a nice, very comfortable palace arrest, and the movement kind of dissipates except for the true believers who say, well, he's still the Messiah, because the Messiah needs to go down to the deepest levels of struggle, which is in the depths of Islam, before he can then resurrect the world. So, and then you have a whole history of like secret Sabbateans and the Sabbatean controversy. It's a whole very interesting story in the history of Jewish mysticism. The Jewish scholar who told the history of Shabtai Tzvi, who wrote the book on Shabtai Tzvi, is Gershom Sholem. So Gershom Scholem was a German Jewish scholar who immigrated to Israel before the establishment of Israel and sort of established the whole field of the academic study of Jewish mysticism. And he wrote, it's a 900-page, I think, biography of Shabtai Tzvi, that he's analyzed every single document he could find in any document, any library anywhere in the world, and told the story about this Jewish mystic who was, for a short period of time, the majority of the Jewish people thought he was the Messiah, and it was the Messianic movement. And Gershom Scholem became a strong Zionist and a very important figure in the establishment of Israeli culture. And he and Hannah Arendt had a correspondence, and we're going to come back to Gershom Scholem when we talk about Eichmann in Jerusalem, because Gershom Scholem was very upset with the position that Hannah Arendt took, and also in her critiques of Zionism in the late 40s that we'll talk about today. And they had quite a bitter exchange back and forth. Two different German Jews, one moves to Israel, one moves to the United States, with two very different takes on Israel and what, where the direction the Jewish people should go. So a note about Gershom Scholem. This is a story where it's an old story from the culture of the Jewish Theological Seminary, where I was trained, that he would give a lecture at JTS and was introduced by Saul Lieberman. It was sort of the dean of rabbinic scholarship. And Professor Lieberman would introduce Scholem, and he would say, Jewish mysticism is nonsense, but the history of Jewish mysticism is a very important science. That's the classic line in sort of seminary lore. So what I want to say about Gershom Scholem is that Gershom Scholem is sort of a standard Zionist intellectual. Hannah Arendt is an iconoclast. She challenges everything. So Gershom Scholem's, for him, Shabtai Tzvi was very important in sort of understanding the arc of Jewish history, that he saw the Shabtai Tzvi, from Gershom Scholem's perspective, he saw the Shabtai Tzvi movement as the beginning of modern Jewish history, because for him, that marked the first awakening of an international Jewish national consciousness. International because Jews are across the world, Sephardim, Ashkenazim, all different countries. There was this sense that there is a Jewish people spread, dispersed throughout the whole world, and it should come into its own, and it should re-achieve sovereignty in the ancient land of Israel, like the ancient Israelite kings of old, which is the idea of Zionism, right? So he saw the Sabbatean movement as the beginning of Zionism. So Gershom Scholem kind of starts modern Jewish history in the middle of the 1600s. And Hannah Arendt also, she inherits that idea from Gershom Scholem, that the Sabbatean movement is really important, but she takes it the opposite direction. Where Gershom Scholem understands the Sabbatean movement as the beginning of Zionism, which for him is the essence of modern Jewish history, culminating in the establishment of Israel. For Hannah Arendt, the Sabbatean movement marks the end of the end of Jewish politics, or the decline, because she says, since the last 200 years it has degenerated. Our national decline began with the collapse of Shabtai Tzvi. Since then, we have proclaimed existence as such without national content, and usually without even religious content as a value in itself. So, meaning that we just became dormant. That when the Sabbatean movement collapsed, she argues, there's no more Jewish politics. That we just kind of became very, very passive. And we allowed things to happen to us, which gets worse and worse and worse until the Holocaust, when the worst of the worst and the unimaginable could happen. And she says it's because we failed to develop a political consciousness, which is why she's calling for a Jewish army, right, for boots on the ground. Says the Jewish people, and this is a great metaphor, the Jewish people began to resemble an old man who at the age of 80 makes a wager with himself that he will make it to 120. That's in Jewish. We always say ad mea v'esrim, until 120. So, and who now? And the idea is, it's wonderful. We should be thankful, those of us who live to 80. We're unlikely anyone will win a bet that will make it to 120. Right? 120 is the goal because Moses lives to 120. So that's why in Jewish culture you always say to 120. So, who makes a so the Jewish people began to resemble an old man who at the age of 80 makes a wager with himself that he will make it to 120, and who now, with the aid of an ingenious diet, and by avoiding any movement, turns his back on life in order to devote himself to survival. Thus he lives from one birthday to the next and looks forward to this one day in the year so that he can call out to the astonished and no longer entirely well-wishing relations, "Look, I've done it again. Another year in the bank." And her point is, but he's not really living, right? It's just, he's only living for the purpose of making another birthday because he wants to get his wager to 120. It's just survival for just the purpose of survival without any action. And then she turns from a joke to seriousness. She says, at the moment, Hitler is busy snuffing out this old man's life. It is the hope of all of us that he is making a mistake, that he will have to deal not with the old men, but with the men and women of a nation. Right? She's writing this in 1941, right? And that the Jewish people, we need to act not as a dying older man who's just trying to live from birthday to birthday, but as a people that is taking action in his hands, right? And is living for the sake of living. So it's a very powerful point. And then a Jewish army need not be a utopia from every country if Jews from every country demand it and are prepared to join it as volunteers, right? It's not a pipe dream if the Jewish people really stand up for its survival and its life. It is, however, utopian to believe we could profit in any way from the defeat of Hitler if this defeat is not in part our doing, right? We're not going to gain anything from defeating Hitler unless we take part in it and we start living as a people. So I say, only a real war of the Jewish people against Hitler will put an end, a well-deserved end, to the fantastic talk of the Jewish war. Freedom is not a gift, as the old and yet very relevant Zionist saying is, neither is freedom a reward for suffering endured. This is totally embracing Zionist worldview of lifting up arms, and making our own history for us. And then I'm not going to read the rest of the section, but just one more point. A truth hitherto unknown to the Jewish people, which it is only just beginning to learn, is that you can defend yourself, is that you can only defend yourself as that for which you are being attacked. This we talked about last time also. She said that you have to defend yourself as a Jew, right? This was her disagreement with Karl Jaspers when I read that correspondence last time, that he was saying, think beyond, think about the humanist ideas. And she said, but I was attacked as a Jew in Germany, so I have to respond as a Jew. And it's not parochial. That's in response to the way that I was, that's the only way that one can appropriately respond. She says, a man attacked as a Jew cannot defend himself as an Englishman or a Frenchman. The world can only conclude from this that he is simply not defending himself at all. This principle of the political struggle will perhaps now have been learned by those tens of thousands of French Jews who also feared the Jewish war and believed they had to defend themselves as Frenchmen, only to end up being held in special Jewish prison camps in Germany by their French fellow combatants. That's a very personal realism that she's taking, right? Because she left Germany for France, where the Jews in France were thinking, the answer is for us to defend ourselves as French. And even the Jews who left Germany, remember I read that passage, said they were perfect Germans in Germany, and now they're all of a sudden become perfect Frenchmen. But she says that's not what's happening there, because the French turned them in also. And there's a very, very, there's a sense of hurt, that she's calling out there in that passage. One group of people who have certainly learned it are the throngs of Jewish volunteers who thought they could combine their fight against Hitler with the fight for naturalization, and who now find themselves in French internment camps or building the Sahara Railway, where they were put to labor. They can count themselves lucky if they are not compelled to take part in the war against England and Russia, as she counts herself lucky because she was able to get out of France. David had a question. Uh-huh.
Where a faction wants to say that the Israeli declaration, which supports rights and freedoms for all people, and against the World Zionist organization, which wants to support freedoms, such freedoms for Jews.
Yeah, no, that tension between the universalism and the nationalism is, and she's not definitive. She's not consistent across the board. Like there's a passage in one of the other pieces in this book where she's saying how so many Germans tell them they're ashamed to be German. She's talking about her teacher, for example, Karl Jaspers, and her response is, "Why don't you be ashamed about being human?" Because she flows in and out of that. And the story about the important story to talk about with Hannah Arendt and Zionism, and I'll share you some of these also, is that she kind of makes her break with the Zionist movement after the end of World War II, as we're in the period of the time leading up to the establishment of Israel. And there's a few sections. Let me just find wait a second, no, not the crisis in Zionism Reconsidered. Yeah, there's in one article she writes called Zionism Reconsidered, and these articles are printed in the book, it's The Jewish Writings. That's a collection of all of her Jewish writings of Hannah Arendt. And then this is one essay, and then I want to read you more from another one, but this is from 1944, where she writes, nationalism is bad enough when it trusts, and what she's doing is she's condemning the decision of the Zionist organization to basically back the move towards sovereignty, because there was a debate in the Zionist movement since it began in the 1890s until the mid-40s. That is the focus going to be establishing a sovereign state, or is the focus going to be on the building up of the Jewish homeland? And for her, there was a difference between the Jewish homeland and the Jewish state. And that the cultural Zionists, the ones associated with the Chad Ha'am, the agricultural movement, was all about just building up Jewish culture and a place for Jews to live, but not concerned with issues of national sovereignty and territorialism, right? And there was the sense that we'll work out a modus vivendi with the Arab neighbors and originally it was even under Herzl, it was going to be under the Ottomans, and then it was going to be under the British. Then you have the shift towards there be a Jewish state its own, which is the turn towards greater nationalism that she was allergic to. And part of that allergy is what she plays out in Origins of Totalitarianism, where she shows the development of nationalism in the 19th century as one of the elements that brings countries in the wrong direction. Jane?
I guess I'm confused because wasn't she decrying the lack of political will when she was talking about the Saké movement?
Yeah, right. And so I said there's a shift. In that movement, she does want to, but when she called for a Jewish army, it wasn't for an independent Jewish state. It was for the Jewish Legion, right? She wanted Jews to be fighting as Jews to defend the Yishuv, right, from the German invasion. But she's making a distinction between that and an actual Jewish nation state.
But I mean, the political reality on the ground, was she blind to the political reality on the ground?
Well, let me share with you how she reads it, and so let me bring you through some of the ideas. So she writes, nationalism is bad enough when it trusts in nothing but the rude force of the nation. But a nationalism that necessarily and admittedly depends upon the force of a foreign nation is certainly worse. So she was concerned about the direction the Zionist movement was taking in the mid-40s, and they didn't know it was a fait accompli, there was going to be an Arab-Israeli war. But there was the felt that if the great powers, that if Great Britain was, enforcing the partition plan that the UN approved in 1947, that they were looking for, British power will establish the Jewish state. And she's questioning that. And essentially she's right to question it, because the British just left. But her point is that it's bad enough when nationalism is dangerous, but then when you pin it on a foreign great power, the danger gets interpreted as colonialism, which is an objection to Zionism that we're still dealing with today. She never says that's appropriate, but she saw that as a danger developing even then. in the 1940s. Said this is the threatened fate of Jewish nationalism and of the proposed Jewish state, surrounded inevitably by Arab states and Arab peoples. Even a Jewish majority in Palestine, even a transfer of Palestine Arabs, which is openly demanded by the revisionists, which is the right wing of the Zionists, would not substantially change a situation in which Jews must either ask protection from an outside power against their neighbors or come to a working agreement with their neighbors. Neither of those happened. Instead, Israel won the War of Independence and had an armistice. And then she has a later essay after the War of Independence when she says, an armistice is not really a peace. And it's just postponing the problems, and the problems will continue to get worse, which is in a sense what we're seeing, what we're still seeing. So I think, though, that she did not put as much, she was extremely nervous in the days leading up to the establishment of the state and in the beginning of the Independence War that Israel would not win. And she saw that and it terrified her. That it was, on top of the catastrophe of Israel, of the Holocaust, to then face a catastrophe again, that how will the Yishuv, will they really be able to win this war? And it's understandable that would terrify her, So, but then in some ways she's, underestimates what we've come to consider the miracle, the establishment of Israel. But she's also very prescient in seeing what the issues are. This passage is extraordinary. She says, the Zionists, if they continue to ignore the Mediterranean peoples and watch out only for the big faraway powers, meaning only concerned with what the U.S., Soviet Union, and what Britain says, and not worried about working things out with their Arab neighbors, will appear only as their tools of the great powers, the agents of foreign and hostile interests. Jews who know their own history should be aware that such a state of affairs will inevitably lead to a new wave of Jew hatred. The anti-Semitism of tomorrow will assert that Jews not only profiteered from the presence of the foreign big powers in that region, but had actually plotted it and hence are guilty of the consequences. That's an extraordinary passage, right? Because she's right. She's right. So much of the anti-Semitism today is anti-Zionist, right, and seeing the Jews as Zionism and the state of Israel as a European colonial power that oppresses the indigenous Palestinian population. And she saw that as a danger, and she's writing this essay. What year did I say? Hold on. She's writing this essay in 1944. And in 1944, she says, this is the anti-Semitism of tomorrow. Boy, was she right. So, whether her solutions to it, I'll take through a bit of that, but she was right to see what the issues are. I want to, as much as I can, share from you, there are a bunch of different essays that she wrote. She wrote a lot in the mid-40s. Most of these are published in the Aufbau, which was the German Jewish paper that was published in Manhattan, and that's where most of these are originally published. But she wrote in English and in German. Most of them are in English. It was a bilingual newspaper, so it had both. Yeah, so I have to take a look. It might have even been in both languages. So, but they're in English in this book, The Jewish Writings, if you want to see them in their entirety. And the key. I had suggested this book by Richard Bernstein called Hannah Arendt and the Jewish Question. He gives you the best quotes from it, if you just want to read one, instead of going back to the original. But I want to, the one that I think, there's several of these. The one that I think is the most interesting is from 1948. She writes this as the war has just started, but before, and it's called To Save the Jewish Homeland. And I'll read you a few pieces out of it. So when on November 29th, 1947, the partition of Palestine, the establishment of a Jewish state were accepted by the United Nations, it was assumed that no outside forces would be necessary to implement this decision. It took the Arabs less than 2 months to destroy this illusion, and it took the United States less than 3 months to reverse its stand on partition, withdraw its support of the United Nations, and propose a trusteeship for Palestine. So everything broke down as soon as the Arabs started fighting. And the trusteeship never happened, right? There were all different ideas. And I'll tell you, the spoiler, right? That she's arguing for trusteeship, which was something that President Truman had suggested once the war started, because there was the concern that Israel would not survive, right? And the U.S. was not, President Truman was not backing Israel's fight. I mean, U.S. was the first country to recognize Israel's sovereign, Israel in the United Nations, to recognize Israel diplomatically, but the United States did not back Israel's war effort. Israel got its arms from Czechoslovakia in the War of Independence, which was approved from Moscow, because Moscow thought, remember, and why did the Soviet bloc vote with the Western bloc against the Arab bloc to pass the partition plan? Because the Soviets thought that they would have a leg there. It was try to forestall American influence. So Israel was still like sort of, it didn't know what side it would end up on in the Cold War. So they were sort of like fighting for influence there. And so she's going to argue for a trusteeship, and I'll get to that at the end of this. But she's talking about the outbreak of there was last-minute appeal for truce, which broke down, and warfare has broken out. And then Zionism has won its most significant victory among the Jewish people at the very moment when its achievements in Palestine are in the gravest danger. Right? Yeah, it's the greatest victory for the Zionist movement, because it's moving towards sovereignty at this moment. But she publishes this in May, right at the time that they're declaring the this state of Israel. Maybe this is like a week or two before the declaration of the state that she writes this essay. But her point is, it's the greatest triumph politically of the Zionist movement, but it also may be its worst mistake, because she was concerned that it might all be wiped out if they lost the battle with the Arabs. And it was not predetermined who would win that fight. And so then she's criticizes the sort of American Jews and their involvement. This is a great also in her sarcastic critique of everyone. Jewish left-wing intellectuals who a relatively short time ago still looked upon Zionism as an ideology for the feeble-minded, that wasn't accepted among the left wing, and viewed the building of a Jewish homeland as a hopeless enterprise that they in their great wisdom had rejected before it was ever started. Jewish businessmen whose interest in Jewish politics had always been determined by the all-important question of how to keep Jews out of newspaper headlines. By the all-important Jewish philanthropists who had resented Palestine as a terribly expensive charity, draining off funds from other more worthy purposes. The readers of the Yiddish press who for decades had been sincerely, if naively, convinced that America was the promised land. All these, from the Bronx to Park Avenue down to Greenwich Village and over to Brooklyn, are united today in the firm conviction that a Jewish state is needed, that America has betrayed the Jewish people, that the reign of terror by the Irgun and the Stern groups, those were the right-wing Jewish groups that were, attacking. For the most famous incident was the blowing up of the King David Hotel. Are real, somewhat too modern, are real statesmen of the Jewish people. And something very similar to this growing unanimity among American Jews has arisen in Palestine itself. So all of a sudden, all the disagreements among American Jews, which she makes fun of there, now everyone's united in supporting the establishment of Israel. And the same thing happened in Palestine, where there used to be a Zionist movement with everyone arguing, everyone else, all these different views, just as Zionism had been a partisan issue among American Jews. So the Arab question and the state issue had been controversial issues within the Zionist movement in Palestine. Political opinion was sharply divided between the chauvinism of the revisionists. Again, the revisionists are the ancestors of the Likud, right? And the middle-of-the-road nationalism of the majority party, that's Ben-Gurion, that becomes the labor establishment in Israel from the establishment until 1977, and the vehemently nationalist, anti-state sentiments of a large part of the anti-nationalist, anti-state sentiments of a large part of the kibbutz movement, the Shomer HaTzair, the communist-leading part. So it was sharp divisions, and now all of a sudden there's this unanimity. Now, we think unanimity is great because everyone's dancing in horrors, waving the Israeli flags. The dream of 2,000 years has been established, and Hannah Arendt is criticizing it. Hannah Arendt, the former Zionist. Why is she criticizing it? So, and then she talks about because part of it is because she's concerned about the unanimity to support those that she says Jewish acts of terror. She's concerned about the divisions in society between the Jews and the Arabs. She's concerned about the course of the war. And then, I'll read you this section. Even more surprising than the growing unanimity of opinion among Palestinian Jews on the one hand and American Jews on the other. Remember, before Israel was established, we used Palestinian was always used for Jews living in Israel. Right? Today, we would only use the term in relation to Arabs in Palestine. And is that they are essentially in agreement, meaning American Jews and Palestinian Jews, i.e. Israeli Jews, are the following more or less roughly stated propositions. The moment has now come to get everything or nothing, victory or death. Arab and Jewish claims are irreconcilable, and only a military decision can settle the issue. The Arabs, all Arabs, are our enemies, and we accept this fact. Only outmoded liberals believe in compromises, only Philistines believe in justice, and only Shlemiels prefer truth and negotiation to propaganda and machine guns. Right? She's painting the view that she's against, right? Because those are the views that she holds. She is a Shlemiel. Because remember, she says you, as a Jew, in the modern world, you're either you're a Shlemiel or a pariah, and you combine those terms. That's her term that she used. She's a pariah, but a pariah is accused of being a Shlemiel. That's right, that's what she's saying there. Jewish experience in the last decades or over the last centuries or over the last 2,000 years has finally awakened us and taught us to look out for ourselves. This alone is reality. Everything else is stupid sentimentality. Everyone is against us. Great Britain is anti-Semitic. The United States is imperialist. Russia might be our ally for a certain period because her interests happen to coincide with ours. In the final analysis, we count upon nobody except ourselves. In sum, we are ready to go down fighting, and we will consider anybody who stands in our way a traitor, and anything done to hinder us a stab in the back. So she says, where you had this huge debate among the Jewish people, all of a sudden everyone is sort of getting into this militaristic chauvinist line, which she's objecting to. And then she has an extraordinary statement there that is going to be applied to so many things else in the way that we interact with other people. And this is where her political theory comes through. She says, unanimity is not a good thing. She says, unanimity of opinion is a very ominous phenomenon and one characteristic of our modern mass age. It's not good when everyone agrees on things. It destroys social and personal life, which is based on the fact that we are different by nature and by conviction. To hold different opinions, to be aware that other people think differently on the same issue, shields us from the godlike certainty which stops all discussion and reduces social relationships to those of an ant heap. Extraordinary sense there. A unanimous public opinion tends to eliminate bodily those who differ. This is the argument she's going to carry through in Origins of Totalitarianism, that when you insist on unanimity of opinion, that's totalitarianism. And that leads to the worst case scenario when you bodily eliminate people who don't fit in, which is genocide, which is the Holocaust. For mass unanimity is not a result of agreement, but an expression of fanaticism and hysteria. In contrast to agreement, unanimity does not stop at certain well-defined objects, but spreads like an infection into every related issue. I'll give you one example in something that's not politically charged at all. So, I'm a member of the Law Committee of the Rabbinical Assembly, and we had just passed two papers in opposition to each other several months ago on driving an electric car on Shabbat. And I and a colleague wrote the liberal position, and two other colleagues of mine wrote the conservative position. So my friend and colleague who was writing the conservative one, he said, I'm so glad that David, and Barry, my colleague, wrote the other one. It said, it's great that we have these both opinions here, so both are endorsed, but we, the members of a law committee, should all vote for both opinions, so that we show that there's total unanimity among the law committee, that both opinions are accepted. No one should vote no on anything. It's like rabbinic logic, right? That we have to have unanimity opinion on enshrining pluralism. Okay, whatever. But But I then made a little speech in the law committee, and I said, it's okay to vote no against an opinion on this table, because that's the acceptance of pluralism. If I didn't accept your view, I would leave the table. The fact that we're sitting on the table and disagreeing with each other on the record shows that we're in conversation with each other. That's essential. And that's why we always preserve dissenting opinions in court procedures, in rabbinic tradition from the very beginning. This is why the rabbis who disagree are always recorded, but they're still a part of the rabbinic body. They're inside the fold, even though they disagree. And that's what she's saying. She knows her positions criticizing the Zionist movement are extremely controversial. All her old friends hated her for what she wrote and condemned her. But she said, let's hold on a second. If we're establishing a new Jewish country, there has to be room for dissent. You can't have a country where everybody is unanimous, because that's dangerous. We know where that can go. We saw where that went in the 1930s, and we have to learn from the lessons of those history. Quick, Jane.
Yeah, but so theoretically, that's great, but we also see how ideological divisions get messy, and how do you achieve consensus to actually vote?
Right, so there's a difference between consensus and unanimity. And I think that's the point, right? Consensus is a compromise. She wants consensus. She wants compromise. She was against the state. Yes, but she wasn't against, but she was, yeah, let me get to where she was. I'll get there. Okay.
Were there any powers like Russia backing the Arab armies? I thought that there were, but maybe I don't know, in 1948.
No great powers backing them.
They just
Yeah. Right, which is why the Arab memory of 1948 was that it was a total one-sided war against us, that Israel was fated to win because we had no support. The whole world left us to be destroyed by the Israeli army, whereas the Israeli memory is we were attacked from all sides. The whole world was going to let us be destroyed after they did nothing in the Holocaust, and was only by some miracle that we managed to survive. So those are the opposing narratives there. And no, the Soviet involvement is what permitted Czechoslovakia to provide arms to Ben Gurion. That's later. Not long later, it's in the 50s. Yeah. Okay, so on this idea of unanimity, she says, she's criticizing the traditional Zionist feeling that is now spreading throughout the Jewish world, that is now sees all sections of the Jewish people, the cynical and deep-rooted conviction that all Gentiles are anti-Semitic and everybody and everything is against the Jews, right? And she's criticizing that. And it's extraordinary that this is someone who's coming out of Nazi Germany and says, we have to resist the temptation to see the world as black and white and see everyone against us, even though everyone did turn against the Jews then. And that's why I think it's so important to read her and to hear what she's saying, because for her to be able to say this after what she went through, it makes it just a very genuine voice and a very powerful voice. She writes, every believer in a democratic government knows the importance of a loyal opposition. The tragedy of Jewish politics at this moment is that it is wholly determined by the Jewish agency and that no opposition to it of any significance exists either in Palestine or America. So that's what she's seeing as a political danger facing the nascent Jewish state, the same time that they're facing a military danger of the war against the Arabs. She did have this fear, as I said, fear of destruction. So she writes, Palestine and the building of a Jewish homeland constitute today the great hope and great pride of Jews all over the world. The building of the Yishuv, she saw as redemptive, as a rebuilding of Jewish living, and that was what excited her about Zionism. What would happen to Jews individually and collectively if this hope and this pride were to be extinguished in another catastrophe is almost beyond imagining. Because she saw the policies of moving towards statehood and bringing on the war with the Arabs as bringing an existential threat to the Yishuv. Whereas would they had gone another direction, they would have been able to greater secure the safety of the Jews, of the peace of the Jews living there. It is certain that this would become the central fact of Jewish history, if the yeshuv were destroyed, the yeshuv means the Jewish establishment in Palestine, and it is possible that it might become the beginning of the self-dissolution of the Jewish people. There is no Jew in the world whose whole outlook on life in the world would not be radically changed by such a tragedy. So there you hear her Jewish soul beating, right? That she is, she's taking a position that's far to the left in the Jewish world, but she's motivated by her love and concern for the future of the Jewish people. So that comes through. And it's understandable why in 1948 she would have that fear, right? There was the existential fear of Jewish continuity. So what's her solution? So she says there's another precedent, and that is close cooperation between two peoples, and idea of Jewish-Arab cooperation, though never realized on any scale and today seemingly farther off than ever, is not an idealistic daydream, but a sober statement of the fact that without it, the whole Jewish venture in Palestine is doomed. Jews and Arabs could be forced by circumstances to show the world that there are no differences between two peoples that cannot be bridged. And the working out of such a modus vivendi might in the end serve as a model to how to counteract the dangerous tendencies of formerly oppressed peoples to shut themselves off from the rest of the world, develop national superiority complexes of their own. So she saw that the only hope was for Jews and Arabs to work together on a local face-to-face level. That was what she's pushing, right? And she said, whereas if you go towards, otherwise the direction now is Jewish nationalism, Arab nationalism, which was closing the window to working out a neighborly relationship where it can work together. And she says, while it seems far off, it's not. That was the other choice, and that's that she saw. And then she writes, and this is again very precious. She says, "There is very little doubt about the final outcome of an all-out war between Arabs and Jews," meaning she thinks the Zionists are going to lose the war. But even if the Jews were to win the war, which we know happened, right, its end would find the unique possibilities and the unique achievements of Zionism in Palestine destroyed. The land that would come into being would be something quite other than the dream of world Jewry, Zionist and non-Zionist. The victorious Jews would live surrounded by an entirely hostile Arab population, secluded inside ever-threatened borders, absorbed with physical self-defense, to a degree that would submerge all other interests and activities. The growth of a Jewish culture would cease to be the concern of the whole people. Social experiments would have to be discarded as impractical luxuries. Political thought would center around military strategy. Economic development would be determined exclusively by the needs of war. And all this would be the fate of a nation that, no matter how many immigrants it could still absorb and how far it extended its boundaries, the whole of Palestine and Transjordan is the insane revisionist demand, would still remain a very small people, greatly outnumbered by hostile neighbors. And in a sense, that is what happened, right? Just in this morning's paper, in the Sunday opinion section, there's an article by David Grossman, who's a great Israeli novelist, who said that Israel feels more like a fortress than a home. It's a very moving and a very well-balanced piece. If you didn't see it, it's in today's Sunday opinion section. And then she writes, under such circumstances, the Palestinian Jews would degenerate into one of those small warrior tribes about whose possibilities and importance history has amply informed us since the days of Sparta, right? The Jews are going to become like Sparta. And their Palestinian Jewry would eventually, it becomes plain that at this moment and under present circumstances, a Jewish state can only be erected at the price of the Jewish homeland. She has this dream of what a Jewish homeland looks, which she saw as her genuine Zionism, and she sees it as turning into a militaristic fortress, which is not the dream of those who put their sweat and tears into the building up of the Yeshuv. Now, again, I don't think her alternative option was a road that was really takeable then. But it's important just to see, but understand, right, and there weren't a lot of other people that were making that argument. There were others. There was a small party in Israel called the Ichud Party that was led by Judah Magnus, who was a very important Reform rabbi who became the founding president of the Hebrew University. And Judah Magnus and Hannah Arendt worked closely together, and he reached out to her to help write the sort of the theoretical groundwork of his political platform, which was to work with, to reach out to, the idea was to convince the Truman administration to establish a trusteeship, because they trusted the Americans more than the British, because the British were tainted because of the white paper. They said they wanted the Americans to come in, and there's no way that the Arabs would fight against American soldiers. So the idea was that it would be put under a trusteeship, that it would be a pause, and it would allow between the Arab and Jewish tensions, it would allow things to sort of calm down, and under sort of the Americans maintaining the peace, that then it would be an opportunity for regional councils, for neighborly councils, for, on a local face-by-face basis to sort of build a society where you can have different peoples living together in the same place. And this goes to her overall political philosophy, that and this is why she, in her more theoretical pieces, she's constantly talking about the Greek heritage, because what she understands is that the root idealism of politics is the direct engagement, that democracy is supposed to be everybody engaged. It's a real democracy, right? And everyone gets together and debates and decides what to do. We do that in some regional levels, and we still say all politics is local politics. But that's what she wanted everywhere, and she saw that as the goal for that, and that on an individual basis, and to let go of the defense issues, let that be covered. You don't need a sovereign state of Israel. What you need is a Jewish homeland. What you need is a place where Jews can live and where Jewish culture can grow and flourish, and you need to be able to build relationships and work out compromises. And compromises are never easy to work out, but you work them out by sitting at a table with your neighbors, and there were no examples of this. This was happening at the same time that the tensions were there, and things, and it still exists in some places in Israel, but tends to be overshadowed by the national conflicts. Magnus died in just after the state was established, and right at this time in 48, and so that small political movement and window closed, first of all because it probably wasn't idealistic. It didn't have the support of either the majority of the Jews or the Arabs, but also the person who was the one who was pushing for it and was the leader of the Jewish intelligentsia in Palestine, because he was the president of the Hebrew University, which is the first modern Jewish university in Jerusalem, died, and then wasn't, in the midst of pushing through that vision. I don't know that if Magnus lived, it would have made a difference. To this day, the academic press of the Hebrew University is called the Magnus Press in his memory, even though his politics are so different from where Israel developed. I'll just give you what her practical conclusion is at the end of the essay. She says, no matter what the outcome of the present deadlock, the following objective factors would be axiomatic criteria for the good and the bad, the right and the wrong. So 1, the real goal of the Jews in Palestine is the building up of a Jewish homeland. This goal must never be sacrificed to the pseudo-sovereignty of a Jewish state. You can see why all her Zionist friends decided to not be friends with her after she said that, right? Number 2, the independence of Palestine can be achieved only on a solid basis of Jewish-Arab cooperation. As long as Jewish and Arab leaders both claim that there is no bridge between Jews and Arabs, the territory cannot be left to the political wisdom of its own inhabitants. Meaning, if she's saying, if the Jews and the Arabs don't see any road to working together, then neither should have sovereignty and bring in the U.S., bring in the G.I. Joes. That's what she's saying. Number 3, elimination of all terrorist groups and swift punishment of all terrorist deeds will be the only valid proof the Jewish people in Palestine has recovered its sense of political reality, and that Zionist leadership is again responsible enough to be trusted with the destinies of the Yishuv. She's not talking about Arab terrorists. She's talking about Jewish terrorists. She's talking about the Irgun. She never forgave Ben Gurion for uniting the Haganah with the Irgun, uniting the defense forces. She felt that rather than, punish those who attacked Arab civilians, right? He brings them on. Now, obviously, Ben Gurion is building a state and had to unite all Jewish arms in the midst of an emergency. Ben-Gurion was a pragmatist. She never forgave him for that. Immigration to Palestine is the irreducible minimum in Jewish politics, right? That's there cannot, that's the thing that we cannot compromise on, that which is the law of return, right? That there has to be a right for all Jews to immigrate to the Jewish homeland. And finally, local self-government and mixed Jewish, Arab, municipal, and rural councils on a small scale and as numerous as possible are the only realistic political measures that can eventually lead to the political emancipation of Palestine. It is still not too late, beginning of May 1948. So we're in a different place now, but this was where she writes her last piece in 1950 where she restates some of those issues again. After that, she doesn't write anything anymore about Zionist politics except for some biting comments in Eichmann in Jerusalem where she again criticizes Ben-Gurion, but a little more restrained, which we'll go through this passage because those were more widely read. These passages were, made a lot of news in the Jewish press, but wasn't really read outside and not remembered as much because they're not in her major works. Let me take 2 comments because I'm late for my Hebrew high school class. Yeah. Yeah, so she actually, right, she criticizes the two-state solution also. She says it's also impractical. And she says that while there are many well-meaning liberals who are supporting the partition plan, she said the problem with the two-state solution, it just postpones the inevitable conflict because you would have 2 states that would be antagonistic to each other. So what she preferred, and another option she talks about is what's called a federated system, kind of like how the way Yugoslavia was being constructed at a time period where you had different nationalities in a federated structure. But she also thought that that was unrealistic in 1948 because there was so much antagonism between the Jews and the Arabs. So she was realistic. When she saw that, she just said that to think that there could be a federation with Jews and Arabs running their country together, we're actually closer to that now than we were then. Because in the last Israeli government, there was an Arab member of the cabinet for the first time in Israeli history. In 1948, she said there's no way that would happen. That's why, along with Magnus, she was calling for, her hope was that Truman would follow through on the trustee plan and that the United States would give the power to Magnus's little Ikhud party that represented practically no one except the intellectual liberal brain trust, and would kind of, and help them organize these works on the ground as sort of a nation in progress that would eventually become a federated state. But she didn't see the two-state solution as reasonable. She actually was ultimately a one-state solution that was a solution where there wasn't the antagonism, where the different peoples could live together, because she saw a nation state as fundamentally problematic, as leading towards hostilities. She has where she talks about it was concerned that it would become Balkanized, with every, when your small countries having their own state, they end up just coming into conflict and it results in wars. And she was trying to envision a different direction. Yeah, Tova. Palmach is the sort of the elite wing of the Haganah. Yeah, she didn't have the problem with them. Her problem was with the Levi and the Irgun, and she talks about one place where there was an attack, bombs were put on, it was Arab workers in Haifa. Haifa was always seen as like the mixed Jewish neighborhood, and there was an Irgun attack against civilians in Haifa that caused and then the Arabs fled, and she was just so angry about that, and then rather than condemn it, then a week after, Ben-Gurion does the union of the Israeli Defense Forces is the union of the Haganah, the Palmach, and the Irgun, and which politically was an extraordinary feat, but for her it was unjust. And she's also always concerned with issues of justice, which is where, she writes all about that in Eichmann, Jerusalem. Okay, next week. 1 week. So we'll, these themes will keep coming back, but we're going to see how it plays through in her historical, theoretical view as we start reading those passages in Origins of Totalitarianism. So we've had a lot of introduction until then we start the real work next week. So hopefully you'll come back. Okay, thanks.